Hello, I am Cameron Bertuzzi, and welcome back to my debate with Stephen Woodford, aka Rationality Rules, on the Kalam cosmological argument. Remember, you can watch all of the videos in this debate at the playlist linked in the description of this video. My second rebuttal, like my first rebuttal, will be broken down into 3 different sections. In section 1, I'll make some general comments. In section 2, we'll look at what Stephen has to say in response to my first premise. And then in section 3, we'll look at what Stephen has to say in response to my second premise. So in the first section of my rebuttal, I have a few things to say and address. First, some of you have asked why Stephen didn't respond to everything that I said in my first rebuttal. Stephen and I actually talked before he posted, and we agreed that it made sense for him to focus on the parts that were most important, otherwise his video was just going to be too long. Second, Stephen and I have agreed to do this round of rebuttals, and then we're going to move into closing statements. So this debate is actually coming to a close pretty soon. Third, I'll quickly respond to Stephen's concerns about me categorizing his arguments as undercutting as opposed to rebutting defeaters. Let's watch what Stephen says about this.
Now I have to say this is quite alarming, as it indicates that Cameron doesn't understand the burden of proof or the nature of debate.
So to be honest, I'm not entirely sure where Stephen is getting this impression. If you notice, immediately after categorizing his arguments as undercutting defeaters, I actually say something positive about his strategy. A benefit of this strategy is that it helps us to check and see if we have any good reason to think that the 2 premises that I offered are true. The fact is, these kinds of distinctions are commonplace in philosophy. When philosophers make a distinction like this, they aren't trying to escape a burden of proof or anything. They're trying to maintain an accurate dialectical perspective. Fourth, I'm going to say just a few things about Stephen's claim that I strawmanned him when I labeled his epistemological view scientism as opposed to empiricism. So a little background on me. I actually hate it when people's views are misrepresented. Not only is it objectively morally wrong to purposefully misrepresent someone's view, I think it's also just a complete waste of time. Instead of attacking someone's actual position, you waste your time and everyone else's time by attacking a view that no one holds. So this is why, before I published my first rebuttal, I actually personally reached out to Stephen and asked him what he meant by the scientific method. It was during this time, however, that Stephen was dealing with the tragic loss of his father, which meant that, pretty understandably, Stephen wasn't able to get around to answering my question for clarification. So based on the information that I had available to me, it seemed more appropriate to label Stephen's epistemological view scientism than it did empiricism. To show you what I mean, let's look at how these terms are defined in the literature. But to get us started, let's again watch what Stephen said in his opening statement.
As an empiricist, I would say that to concretely know something, we must verify it through the scientific method.
With that in mind, here's the definition of empiricism offered in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on rationalism versus empiricism. The empiricism thesis. We have no source of knowledge in S, or for the concepts we use in S, other than sense experience. That definition might sound a little weird and technical, but notice that there's no mention of verification nor any mention of the scientific method. The relevant criterion here is sense experience. And for a long list of additional sources that agree with this definition of empiricism, just check the description. Alternatively, let's see how professional philosopher J.P. Moreland defines scientism in his book, Scientism and Secularism. Roughly, scientism is the view that the hard sciences, like chemistry, biology, physics, astronomy, provide the only genuine knowledge of reality. And remember, Stephen's original claim was that in order to concretely know something, it must be verified through the scientific method. To me, that sounded a whole lot more like scientism as opposed to empiricism, at least with how these terms are defined in the literature. So given the information that I had available to me at the time, I labeled Stephen's view as accurately as I could. This wasn't some slimy apologist scheme to attack a position that Stephen didn't actually hold. Now, I have a whole lot more to say about this issue, but I don't really want to make it the focus of this video. So if you want to see more of what I have to say about scientism and what Stephen said in his video, then just check in the description. Okay, so with these 4 things out of the way, we can move into section 2 of my second rebuttal. So as you know by now, my version of the Kalam cosmological argument has 2 premises. Premise 1, there is a first cause. Premise 2, if there is a first cause, then God exists. And then the conclusion follows, God exists. As a reminder, I defended premise 1 in my opening statement with the following supporting argument. Premise 4, the Grim Reaper scenario is impossible. Premise 5, if the Grim Reaper scenario is impossible, then causal finitism is true, from which it follows causal finitism is true. Premise 7, if causal finitism is true, then there is a first cause, from which it follows there is a first cause. Stephen responded to this argument in his opening statement by first attempting to steelman it, and then second, he presented 3 objections. In my first rebuttal, I didn't respond to his attempted steelman because in my view, it just didn't work. To take one of his examples, denying that any 2 points in time can be divided into smaller and smaller intervals does not actually end up entailing causal finitism. It could simultaneously be the case that any 2 points in time can't be infinitely divided like this, but then also that the past is eternal. These 2 propositions are wholly compatible with each other. Thus, denying that time can be infinitely divided doesn't end up actually supporting causal finitism. So while I appreciated, and I still really appreciate, Stephen's attempt to steelman my argument, and by the way, there's a whole lot that could be said about the virtue of such an approach, I just didn't think that it worked, and so what I did was I focused on the argument that I presented. We'll now review Stephen's 3 initial objections to this supporting argument, my rejoinders to those objections, and then what Stephen said most recently in his response. Stephen's first objection was that the Grim Reaper scenario involves a beginning and therefore cannot apply to an infinite past. I responded to this objection in 2 ways. First, I pointed out how this is really based on a kind of misunderstanding of how my argument works. Second, I pointed out that even if this objection weren't based on a misunderstanding, it doesn't apply to the Grim Messenger paradox. In support of my first response, I said this: it's not that the Grim Reaper paradox by itself implies the existence of a first cause, it's that my solution to the Grim Reaper paradox, namely causal finitism implies the existence of a first cause. Another way of making this same point is that Stephen's objection doesn't actually target any premise in my supporting argument. So let me pull that argument back up on the screen so that you can see what I mean. His first objection doesn't target premise 4, it doesn't target premise 5, and it doesn't target premise 7. Again, it targets no premise in my supporting argument. This is what I meant when I said that this objection doesn't really understand how my argument works. To my surprise, Stephen not only failed to respond to this, he then went on to boldly claim that I abandoned the Grim Reaper paradox.
In his opening, he presented the goalposts of the Grim Reaper paradox, and once I had taken a shot, once I had provided objections, he abandoned the goalpost for a new set, the Grim Messenger paradox.
This is completely false. As we've just seen, I argued that Stephen's objection is based on a misunderstanding. So I didn't abandon my supporting argument, I defended it. I'm not really sure how my defense of my supporting argument went unnoticed, but the point is that it did. It went unnoticed and unresponded to. You might be wondering, well, if I wasn't abandoning the Grim Reaper paradox, then why did I even introduce the Grim Messenger paradox? How does that make any sense? I did so for 2 reasons. A, to anticipate future objections, and B, I wanted to fortify my defense of causal finitism. It's pretty standard practice in philosophy to offer multiple versions of arguments to cover one's bases, and that's basically what I was doing here. As a photographer, I actually do the same thing with cameras. On a shoot, I might not think that it's necessary to have 2 cameras, nevertheless it's wise to have 2 just in case. What's also important to note is that by showing how Stephen's objection doesn't apply to a new version of the paradox, I'm not claiming that Stephen was intentionally designing his objection to work against every version. I'm demonstrating how his objections, even if they did target a premise in my supporting argument, are extremely limited in scope. They aren't the argument-killing type of objections. But again, the thing that I want you to see here is that I defended my supporting argument. I didn't abandon it. Now, on a positive note, Stephen did provide 2 new objections to the messenger paradox that we'll get to in just a moment, but I think first we should continue through Stephen's initial objections to my original supporting argument. Stephen's second objection was that causal finitism does not imply a single first cause. In my first rebuttal, I pointed out that this was actually more of an objection to my second premise as opposed to my first premise. In his response, Stephen claimed that I
sidestepped this criticism entirely by insisting that it is not an objection of his misuse of causal finitism, but rather it's an objection to his second premise.
Fortunately, I think this whole issue can be resolved with a simple clarification. My first premise says there is a first cause, but it doesn't say that there is a single first cause. As an analogy, if I claim that there's a sheep in the field and even refer to the sheep as the sheep, that's not the same as claiming that there's a single sheep in the field. For all I know, maybe there are other sheep in the field. To get a bit more technical, the way that I phrased my first premise is consistent with how philosophers use the existential quantifier in predicate logic. The little symbol that looks like a backward E and an X next to each other actually gets translated there exists an X and is standardly taken to mean that there is at least one X. This is why I categorize Stephen's second objection as more of an objection against my second premise as opposed to my first premise. As I've thought about it, however, I realized that I was actually wrong here. Stephen's second objection doesn't target my second premise. All my second premise says is that if there is a first cause, then God exists. It doesn't claim that there is a single first cause. Moreover, premise 7 in my supporting argument merely says that if causal finitism is true, then there is a first cause. Again, it's not claiming that there is a single first cause. So, interestingly, this objection targets no premise in any of my arguments. Moving on, Stephen's third objection was,
even if it is the case that certain kinds of large and small denurable physical infinities are impossible, it does not follow that therefore all kinds of large and small denurable physical infinities are impossible.
In reply, I explained that this objection was based on yet another misunderstanding of my argument. So I'll pull back up on the screen one more time my supporting argument for my first premise. Again, notice no premise in my argument assumes that all kinds of large and small denumerable physical infinities are impossible. Remember, all causal finitism says is that every event or state has a finite causal history. It doesn't rule out an actually infinite number of physical things. And unfortunately, in his response, Stephen made no reply to this. As I've reflected more on what's happened in response to my first premise, all three of Stephen's initial objections fall into the same category. They target no premise in any of my arguments. So before I address Stephen's two new objections to the Grim Messenger paradox, let me clear up yet another misunderstanding. The Grim Reaper and Grim Messenger paradoxes are not completely different arguments, as Stephen claims. While the paradoxes themselves have important differences, like one involves a supertask and the other doesn't, the way that they arrive at a first cause is identical. To see what I mean here, I'll pull back up my supporting argument. If you notice, all that needs to be done in the case of the messenger paradox is to swap out a couple words. So as you can see, the way that each paradox is being used to arrive at a first cause is completely identical. These are different paradoxes, but they're not completely different arguments. All right, so let's get on to Stephen's two objections against the messenger paradox. In a nutshell, Stephen's first objection is that assigning natural numbers to all of the messengers is impossible because the nature of a potential infinite prohibits this.
Now, over the last few days, I've been thinking of various ways to make the flaw more obvious, and my favourite so far is to simply flip the numbers assigned to the messengers from ascending to descending. Instead of this year's messenger being assigned number 1, last year's being assigned number 2, and so on, tell me the number assigned to this year's messenger given a potential infinite of assigned messengers before it. You can't. The very nature of a potential infinite prohibits this. Hence, today's Reaper not only doesn't know its number, but can't know its number.
So 3 quick responses to this. First, the scenario I laid out doesn't actually involve a potential infinite. The set of natural numbers is actually infinite, it's not potentially infinite. Similarly, an infinite past is actually infinite, it's not potentially infinite. Now, what can be potentially infinite is a process of counting or assigning numbers. But the scenario that I gave does not involve such a process. The messengers simply have their numbers as part of the scenario. Second, the reason that the order of the messengers can't be reversed is the same reason that you can't reverse the ascending order of all natural numbers. It actually has nothing to do with potential infinites. Third, the messenger scenario doesn't even need to involve numbers at all. Each messenger could be tasked with drawing a unique symbol, for example. For these reasons and other reasons, I don't think that Stephen's first objection is successful. Stephen's second objection to the messenger paradox is that it's begging the question. In the words of Stephen,
it's begging the question, since it assumes a first state, the initial condition of a blank message, in order to prove that there must have been a first state.
My reply to this is simply no. The paradox does not involve a first state. It expressly assumes the opposite. It assumes that there is no first state. Stephen then says that his objection might be a little bit clearer if I were to present a syllogistic form of my argument, so I'll put it back on the screen one more time. So to quickly summarize section 2 of my second rebuttal, Stephen's 3 initial objections target no premises in any of my arguments, and then Stephen's 2 objections to the messenger paradox have been rebutted. As it currently stands, my first premise is actually on really solid ground in this debate. Moving into section 3, if you remember, I presented another supporting argument in defense of my second premise in my opening statement. I'll put it back on the screen for all of us to look at. Interestingly, Stephen did not provide a single new objection to this argument in his rebuttal. The first thing that he does is claim that my argument from limits didn't exist in my opening statement.
Cameron is of course correct to state that his argument from limits is valid, but if you go through the entirety of his opening, you'll notice that this syllogism is nowhere to be found. Indeed, it didn't exist in his opening. It didn't exist until his rebuttal.
So here's a quick summary of my defense of my second premise. Premise 9, if there is a first cause, then it has no limits. And we saw why this is true. Anything that is limited has a cause. So if the first cause is limited, then it has a cause. However, the first cause is uncaused, so it has no limits. Moving right along, Stephen gave us some more insight into his own personal epistemological views. He claimed that for things which we lack concrete examples, we need
sufficient knowledge to base our inference from.
I'm happy to report that I actually agree with something very close to this. While I'm not so sure about the knowledge part here, I'm definitely convinced that we need sufficient evidence or sufficient reason to base our inferences on. My argument from limits, and then the 3 additional arguments that I gave, that an unlimited first cause has to be perfect, together form a sufficient basis on which we can infer that God exists, as long as these arguments are sound. Stephen made another comment that I think is worth addressing as well, because it ties into something I said in my opening statement.
Indeed, the uncaused hasn't been demonstrated to exist at all, let alone that it has any properties.
Aside from the arguments that I've already presented in defense of an uncaused first cause, it's actually fairly easy to demonstrate that something uncaused must exist. So consider for a moment the totality of everything that exists. It's impossible that the totality of reality has some kind of outside cause. By definition, there can't be something like outside of everything that exists. Hence, either the totality itself or some part of the totality exists without a cause. I would drop this mic, but it's on a stand. So given that something uncaused must exist, the question that I posed in my opening statement becomes all the more relevant. What is a relevant difference between the caused and the uncaused? One of the reasons that this is such a profound question is that everything in our experience seems to have a cause. But notice, if I just add up a bunch of caused things, I don't suddenly have like an uncaused plurality of things. If I add up all the caused things on my desk, I don't have like a suddenly an uncaused desk. In the exact same way, if we add up like all the caused things in the universe, we don't suddenly have an uncaused set of things. Apparently, proposing a relevant difference and then encouraging you, the audience, to really think earnestly about this problem for yourself is, according to Stephen, a cop-out. Second, I offered limits as a relevant difference between the caused and the uncaused, and this is really important, as a proposal. I wanted Stephen and everybody watching to really think hard about the problem for yourself.
If I'm honest, this strikes me as a cop-out, a dodge. And I have to say, if Cameron wants me, or you, the viewer, to create his arguments for him, then he's rendered himself redundant.
I'm really sorry that it struck you that way, Stephen. The reason that I framed my argument in terms of a proposal is that A, I wanted to lower the cost of rejecting it, because that can actually be a hurdle, and then B, I wanted people to really think hard about the problem and then really seriously consider my proposal. With respect to A, I don't want to give the impression that someone that disagrees with my argument is like irrational. I believe that rational disagreement is possible. And with respect to B, a good argument presented in the wrong way can actually succeed in turning people away from the truth. And more than winning a debate, which I think is important, it's important to win debates, I want truth to be like the main thing. I want truth to flourish. So in summary, I want people to really think hard and clearly about these issues and then come to your own assessment, your own conclusions. All right, I think I've said enough on that. Let's turn back to Stephen's comments. Lastly, Stephen requests a defense of the crucial premise in my argument from limits.
Cameron needs a sound argument for this premise, and until he provides one, his argument is, like Fred, dead.
The premise that Stephen is referring to is premise 13. For reference, that premise says, anything that is limited has a cause. If you watched both of my previous videos, you'll know that this premise was indeed defended. In my first rebuttal, I said this, and note that this premise has wide empirical support, even if we accept Stephen's narrow scientific criteria. So what empirical support was I referring to? Let's go back to my opening statement. Part of the reason why we think that rocks and branches and people and cars and mountains have causes is because they're limited in various ways. In general, limits have causes. There's a reason why my computer right here has a 2 terabyte hard drive instead of a 4 terabyte hard drive. There's a reason that I have the limited amount of power that I have. For example, I haven't been to the gym in a while. Limits, or things that possess limits, have causes. Alternatively, let's think about something that has no limits. Some atheists will say that an eternal universe doesn't need a cause. An eternal universe has no limit in time. It never began to exist. Removing a limit, in this case, removes the need for a causal explanation of that limit. An infinite universe doesn't need an explanation, so say many atheists. So there's actually 2 distinct arguments going on in this clip, so I'm going to take some time, slow down, and really unpack these 2 things that are going on here. The first argument involves what you might refer to as inductive generalization. In general, limits have causes. Inductive generalization is just a fancy way of saying what's true of things in my experience is probably true of those same things beyond my experience. The inference kind of goes like this. If every A in my experience is B, then probably every A is B. If you think about it, scientists and pretty much everybody use this type of inference a lot. Gravity works the same everywhere that I go, so probably gravity works the same everywhere. Now, it could possibly be the case that some A is not B. However, if in your experience every A is B, then it's probably safe to assume that probably every A is B. And again, this is a probabilistic argument. That's how inductive arguments work. They're probabilistic. And all that's left is to just reflect on what's true of limited things in our experience. In the clip, I cited 2 examples, mainly because of time and interest. If I was to list the thousands and thousands and thousands of examples there are, then it would have been pretty boring and pretty tedious. So I didn't do that. The point is that we have overwhelming empirical support for the truth of premise 13. The second argument embedded in this clip, and actually in like the rest of my opening statement, appeals to a widely shared rational intuition about the nature of limits. It kind of just seems obvious that limits have causes. My limited computer has a cause for its existence. My limited desk has a cause for its existence. Limits seem to be the kind of thing that have causes. Notice, however, that this intuition kind of weakens when we consider things that don't have limits. In the clip, I gave an example of an eternal universe. It's not obvious, and a lot of atheists would agree with this, it's not obvious that a universe that is unlimited in time needs a cause for its existence. So intuitively, it does just kind of seem like limits are a relevant difference between the caused and uncaused. Someone might object to my second argument by claiming that rational intuitions just aren't a reliable guide to reality. Many of the things that we've intuitively believed about the world have turned out to be false. I'll say 2 things in reply to this objection. First, I believe that our rational intuitions are grounded in our sense of reason. Oh, and by the way, it's a complete myth that humans only possess 5 senses. But note, none of our senses are infallible. Sometimes they get it wrong. My sense of sight is generally reliable, but it can get things wrong. Negative influences on any of our senses can trigger false positives. The negative influence of dehydration, for example, can sometimes cause vivid hallucinations. Similarly, the negative influence of cognitive bias can cause false beliefs. The important point to note here, though, is that these negative influences don't render our senses completely unreliable. We can learn to recognize these negative influences and then avoid them the best we can. That's basically a really long way of saying that while I think and agree that our sense of reason is fallible, I don't think it follows that it's completely unreliable. Second, I'm a real big fan of using multiple arguments to all arrive at the same conclusion. This is why I didn't just appeal to rational intuition. I also gave an argument from inductive generalization. These 2 arguments should be thought of as like mutually reinforcing. Last thing I want to say is that I could give more arguments in support of premise 13. Nevertheless, I think that there's enough arguments on the table as it is. So in summary of section 3, Stephen provided no new objections to my second premise. I agree that we need sufficient reason to base our inferences from. That's why I gave multiple arguments. I'm not here just to win a debate. I also want to make genuine philosophical progress. And my argument from limits, along with a defense of the premises, were both in my opening statement. To save some time, I'm not going to do like a whole summary of this video like I've done in my 2 previous videos, so sorry in advance for that. But I'm going to leave you with this. Stephen, despite our disagreements, I love you like a brother. And I'm not saying that just for internet points. I'm really, really sorry to hear about what happened to your dad. And I just also wanted to say thank you so much for the comments that you sent to me about Ben. So I just really appreciate that. I'm really looking forward to actually getting a real cup of tea with you in person one day.